It was just another day in the city, or so it seemed. The hustle and bustle of everyday life, people going about their routines, their heads down, lost in their thoughts. But what happens next will challenge the very way we think about kindness, race, and justice. You see, sometimes, it's the smallest gestures that create the biggest impact, but other times, it's the smallest acts of hatred that can spiral out of control, threatening to tear apart the very fabric of society. This story starts with a simple but powerful act of kindness. A young black teen, no older than 16 or 17, is on his way home from school, riding the bus like so many others. But today was different. Today, he saw something that would forever change his life. A pregnant white woman was standing in the crowded bus, clutching her belly, clearly struggling to keep her balance. Without a second thought, this teen stood up and offered her his seat. It wasn't something out of the ordinary, just an act of compassion that too often goes unnoticed. But what happened next was extraordinary. The woman, deeply moved, handed him a note as she took her seat. Little did he know that note would change his life forever. While this act of kindness set the stage for something bigger, it was just one part of a story that would unfold in the most unexpected way. Across the city, a call had come in. An emergency. A black paramedic, a dedicated man who had been saving lives for years, was racing to the scene in his ambulance. He was focused on one thing: getting the patient to the hospital as quickly and safely as possible. But what he didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that this was going to be a day unlike any other. The paramedic, unaware of the chaos about to unfold, was simply doing his job when he was pulled over by a police officer. The officer's mood was already tense, and what happened next would send shockwaves through the community. Without reason, the officer approached the ambulance and punched the paramedic, escalating the situation in a way that no one could have foreseen. The twist? The officer had no idea that the paramedic's son, the same teen who had just given up his seat to the pregnant woman on the bus, was lying in the back of that ambulance, desperately needing help. The tension in the air thickened as the story began to unfold in ways no one could have expected. How could the officer not know? What was the reason for his unprovoked violence? Was it simply because of the paramedic's skin color, or was something deeper at play? The scene was chaotic, but the real question lingered in the air. Would this innocent act of kindness by a young black teen be overshadowed by violence and injustice? As the paramedic's son lay in the back of the ambulance, unaware of the growing danger, he had no idea that the actions of a racist police officer would forever change the course of his life and the lives of those around him. But that wasn't all. It was the note given to the teen earlier on the bus that would soon come back into play, unlocking a chain of events no one could have predicted. This is a story of race, justice, and the incredible power of kindness in the face of adversity. As we move deeper into this story, you'll see how everything is connected, how one small act of kindness on a bus set in motion a series of events that would lead to one of the most heartbreaking and eye-opening moments of the teen's life. Will justice prevail? Will the teen ever get the chance to truly understand the impact of his actions? Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where the shocking truth about the paramedic, his son, and the racist officer will be revealed, and you'll see how a single moment of kindness can change everything, even in the face of the most painful obstacles. The moments before the punch felt surreal to the paramedic. His name was Marcus Williams, and he had been a first responder for nearly a decade. He'd seen it all: accidents, fires, heart attacks, and everything in between. He'd saved lives, held hands through the worst of moments, and comforted the grieving. But nothing prepared him for what would happen that day. Marcus had been called to an emergency, a serious car crash just outside the city. As he drove through the busy streets in the ambulance, his mind was focused on one thing: getting to the scene as quickly as possible. He glanced in the rearview mirror, checking on his young son, Trey, who had been in the back with him that day. Trey was recovering from a mild concussion from a fall, and Marcus thought it would be okay to bring him along for the ride, as long as he stayed in the back, out of harm's way. He was doing better, but still, Marcus wasn't completely sure he was ready to be back out. Yet he'd been called to duty, and duty came first. The sounds of sirens and the rush of vehicles all around them created a sense of urgency. The crash was serious, multiple vehicles, victims with critical injuries, and a need for immediate intervention. Marcus' hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as the adrenaline coursed through his body. He glanced at Trey again. The boy had been remarkably quiet, staring out of the window as though trying to escape into his thoughts. They were only a few minutes away when it happened. The ambulance was forced to pull over. Marcus barely had time to react as a squad car quickly followed them, its siren wailing loudly in the otherwise quiet afternoon. The officer, whose name was Detective Ray Collins, was already having a rough day. He had been chasing down leads, facing pressure from higher-ups about the rising crime rates in the city, and dealing with his own internal struggles that had little to do with his job but affected it all the same. When the officer saw the ambulance, he thought he saw an opportunity to exert control over the situation. Without fully understanding what was going on, he assumed the driver of the ambulance was just another person trying to avoid the law. Perhaps the sirens had been turned on just to clear traffic, or maybe the vehicle wasn't even responding to an emergency. He didn't know the paramedic story, didn't know what he had been doing, and certainly didn't know that the person sitting quietly in the back was his own son. Marcus had no time to argue. As soon as the ambulance came to a halt, Collins stepped out of his car with a gruff expression, his hand resting near the holster of his gun. There was something in his eyes, something hardened, perhaps even too quick to judge. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer barked. Marcus was confused, but immediately followed orders. He opened the driver's side door and stepped outside, his mind still focused on the crash ahead and the patients who needed him. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, keeping his tone calm. "You don't get to make the decisions here," Collins snapped. "You're supposed to pull over when law enforcement asks. We don't just let ambulances cut through traffic whenever they feel like it." Marcus tried to explain, to tell him that they were responding to a call, but the officer wasn't having it. His words were sharp, filled with the bitterness that Marcus had experienced so many times before. He'd dealt with officers who treated him as less than human because of the color of his skin. But today, things were different. The officer's anger seemed misplaced, disconnected from the situation at hand. "You're in a rush to save someone's life, huh?" Collins said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What if you're just trying to avoid getting caught speeding?" He stepped closer, invading Marcus's personal space. Marcus' patience was wearing thin, but he had learned over the years that engaging in a power struggle with someone in uniform usually wasn't worth the risk. But the officer wasn't backing down. And before Marcus could react, Collins raised his fist and struck him hard in the chest, knocking him backward against the side of the ambulance. The sudden impact left Marcus stunned. He wasn't sure if it was the blow that hurt more or the realization that, once again, he was being judged, not for his actions but for the color of his skin. Meanwhile, in the back of the ambulance, Trey was lying there, unaware of what was happening outside. He had fallen asleep shortly after they'd left the house. But the noise from the altercation had begun to seep in through the thin walls. Trey's heart raced. He woke up trying to understand what was going on. The thought that his father might be in trouble never crossed his mind, but there was a strange sense of panic in the air. He listened closely. The sounds of raised voices. The sharpness of the words. He could feel it, a tension that made him feel small in the back of that big vehicle.
Trey wanted to do something.
He wanted to go out there and help, to be the one to make everything okay. But he was just a kid. What could he do? Outside, the situation escalated. The officer continued his tirade, pushing Marcus further into a corner. In his mind, Marcus knew he couldn't stay there, not with his son in the back, not with lives hanging in the balance. But as he tried to back away, to reach for his radio and call for backup, the officer wouldn't let up. "You think you can just do whatever you want because you're wearing a badge?" Collins shouted. "I'm the one in control here." Marcus could feel the weight of it all. The racial tension, the frustration, the sense of powerlessness. He had been in situations like this before, but never with his son so close, so vulnerable. His first instinct was to protect Trey, to make sure he didn't see any of this. But how could he do that when the very person in power was the one causing harm? The next moments were a blur. The officer's hand shot out again, this time aiming for Marcus's face. But before the punch could land, something unexpected happened. A shout rang out from behind the officer, and Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. It was Trey. Trey had opened the ambulance door and was standing there, his eyes wide with fear. "Dad," he cried out, his voice trembling. Marcus' world seemed to slow down in that instant. The officer turned around, surprised by the boy's sudden appearance. Trey's face was filled with confusion, worry, and something else, something deep in his eyes that made Marcus' chest tighten. This wasn't just a confrontation between an officer and a paramedic anymore. This was something much deeper. Before Marcus could speak, before he could explain, the officer's gaze met Trey's. The look in Colin's eyes shifted, and for a brief moment, there was something in his face that seemed almost guilty. But it wasn't enough to stop the storm that was brewing. Trey's appearance caught everyone off guard, especially the officer. His eyes flickered from Trey to Marcus, then back again. A mix of surprise and something else, something Marcus couldn't quite place. But there was no time to dwell on it. The tension was too thick, and everything felt like it was on the verge of snapping. Trey's heart was racing, his small frame trembling in the doorway, unsure of what to do next. He had never seen his father in a situation like this before, and the sight of an officer, someone in authority, getting so close to his dad, a man he respected and looked up to, made him feel small, insignificant, and powerless. Marcus was torn. His instincts screamed at him to protect Trey, to shield him from the ugliness of the world outside. But Trey was already in it, already exposed to the realities of prejudice, injustice, and the systemic barriers his father had battled his whole life. Marcus knew the bitter truth. Trey wasn't going to escape this world without confronting the darkness lurking just beneath the surface, no matter how hard he tried to protect him. The officer stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed. The sight of Trey standing there, his youthful face painted with confusion and fear, seemed to give him pause. Maybe for a brief moment, he felt the weight of his own actions. Maybe he didn't. But what was clear was that Collins wasn't backing down. "Get back inside the ambulance, kid," Collins barked, his voice hardening, his frustration bubbling up once again. But there was something in his tone that hinted at something deeper, something Marcus couldn't quite understand. Trey didn't move. His hands clenched into fists, his eyes locked onto the officer's. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, each second loaded with uncertainty. Marcus could feel the pressure building, a wave of emotions crashing over him. He didn't want Trey to be a part of this mess, but it seemed like the universe had other plans. "Please, Trey," Marcus said softly, trying to calm him down, trying to restore some sense of control in the chaotic moment. "Get back in the ambulance, son. It's okay." But Trey's voice cracked as he responded, his words carrying more weight than any child should have to speak. "Why is he doing this, Dad? What did we do wrong?" His voice was filled with confusion and hurt, a child trying to make sense of the impossible. For Marcus, that question hit him harder than any punch could. What did they do wrong? His mind raced, searching for answers that felt elusive. Why was it that people like him, Black men, had to constantly justify their existence? Why was it that a simple act of kindness, offering a seat to a pregnant woman, could seem so irrelevant in the face of an officer's animosity? But Marcus didn't have time to dwell on his own questions. He had to focus. He had to protect his son, even if it meant swallowing his own pride and enduring the ugliness that came with it. He turned back to the officer, his voice steady but firm. "I'm just trying to do my job."
You can see that.
"I'm trying to help people." Collins didn't seem moved. "You think I don't see that?" he spat, stepping closer again, his body language hostile. "I don't care what you're trying to do. This isn't about saving lives. This is about you thinking you're above the law." The words stung, cutting through the air like a razor. Marcus knew all too well that this wasn't about the law. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about power, about control, and about the way a person like Marcus was seen by someone like Collins. The officer's words weren't just an accusation. They were a reminder of the systemic hatred that existed in places Marcus never thought it would show its ugly face. It wasn't just in dark alleys or secret whispers. It was in uniforms, in badges, in institutions that had built themselves on the backs of people like Marcus. The anger bubbled up in Marcus, but he stifled it. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now, not in front of his son. His heart raced, but he held on to the calm that had kept him grounded through years of pressure, years of feeling invisible, of fighting to be seen for who he was, not the color of his skin. "Let's just calm down," Marcus said, his voice firm yet tired. He tried to reason with the officer, to remind him of the emergency at hand. But Collins wasn't having it. The officer's eyes narrowed, and he reached for his radio, his hand shaking slightly as he keyed it in. Meanwhile, Trey stood frozen, feeling small, unsure of how to help. His father, the man who had always been his hero, was vulnerable, something Trey had never imagined. And it made him feel helpless. His hands still clenched into fists, the confusion and anger swirling inside him. He hated seeing his dad treated like this. He hated the injustice, the unfairness of it all. But what could he do? What was he supposed to do in a world where even kindness seemed to be rejected, where even simple good intentions were twisted into something ugly? There was a long silence after Collins spoke into his radio, a moment of stillness that felt almost deafening. The sounds of the city continued around them, the faint hum of traffic, the distant wail of sirens, the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, but none of it seemed to matter. All that mattered in that moment was the standoff between Marcus and the officer, the tension that threatened to explode at any second. Trey wanted to speak up, to say something that would make everything better, but the words felt stuck in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't sure if there even was anything to say. "Hey," the officer suddenly said, his voice lower, more controlled now. "Get back in the ambulance and I'll let you go. We're done here." Marcus looked at Trey, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. He didn't want to back down, not after everything that had transpired, but he also didn't want to escalate things further. He could feel the pressure of the situation, the expectations, the weight of the world on his shoulders. It was more than just about getting out of this safely. It was about the message it would send to Trey. With a deep breath, Marcus gave a small nod. "Come on, Trey," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's go." But as Trey slowly turned to go back inside the ambulance, the officer's voice stopped him. "One more thing," Collins called out, his tone now shifting again, colder, sharper. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Just another one of those people who thinks they're above the law. But you're not." Trey froze. The words pierced through him like a knife. He had no idea what to say, what to think. He could feel the anger bubbling inside him, the urge to shout, to retaliate. But instead, he did what he knew best. He followed his father's lead, stepping back into the ambulance and closing the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Neither father nor son spoke. Neither of them knew what to say. Neither of them knew how to make sense of the chaos that had just unfolded. But as the ambulance finally pulled away, neither could shake the feeling that this moment, this exchange, had just opened up a new chapter of their lives, a chapter neither of them were ready for. The air in the ambulance felt thick with tension as Marcus and Trey sat in silence. The sounds of the city outside, sirens, the rush of traffic, the distant hum of life going on, seemed distant and muffled as if the world outside had become a different place altogether. Inside the vehicle, Marcus gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind was racing. He couldn't shake the image of Colin's face, the officer's eyes hard with judgment, filled with an unspoken history that seemed to reach back farther than Marcus could fathom. Trey, sitting beside him, was quiet too, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, though his mind was miles away. He couldn't get the officer's words out of his head. "You think you're a hero, don't you?" Trey had never been one to question the things his father taught him, but in that moment, he felt small. The kindness he'd shown to the pregnant woman, the gesture that had seemed so simple and right, now felt insignificant. It wasn't enough to make a difference in a world that kept throwing obstacles in his path, in a world that didn't seem to value people like him. Marcus glanced at Trey, his son's face drawn and pale in the dim light of the ambulance. He wanted to say something, to reassure him that this would pass, that they would be okay, but the truth was he didn't know. They hadn't even made it to the crash site yet, and already, everything felt like it was falling apart. The sirens had gone silent, the flashing lights no longer a beacon of hope. Everything had turned eerily quiet. The moment they pulled away from the scene, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Something was coming. Something worse. As they continued driving, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about Collins. The officer's sudden shift from anger to something darker had unsettled him. The way he'd looked at Trey, there was something there, a flicker of something that Marcus couldn't quite place. It didn't make sense. Why had Collins reacted that way? Why had he punched him, of all people, when he could have simply asked questions, when he could have taken a moment to assess the situation? Something was off. And Marcus couldn't let it go. "Do you think that's it, Dad?" Trey finally spoke, his voice soft, like he was afraid to disturb the fragile silence between them. "Do you think he'll just let it go?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure. He wanted to say yes, that the officer would move on and forget about it, that this was just a bad encounter they'd get past. But the reality of the situation told him otherwise. Collins had a grudge. Marcus could feel it in his bones. And that wasn't something that would just go away. "Stay low," Marcus said quietly, keeping his eyes on the road. "We're going to finish this job and get out of here. Just keep your head down, Trey. Everything's going to be fine." But Trey wasn't so sure. His father's words were meant to comfort him, but they only heightened the unease in his chest. As the ambulance turned onto a quiet, dimly lit street near the crash site, something felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. Just as Marcus was about to reach the intersection leading to the accident, his headlights flashed across something that made his stomach drop. A police car parked just ahead, its lights flashing a muted red. And standing by the car was Collins. The sight of the officer made Marcus' pulse race. His first instinct was to keep driving, to avoid any more trouble. But they couldn't turn back now. The emergency was right ahead, the patients waiting, lives depending on them. He didn't have a choice. He slowed the ambulance, but the moment he did, Collins stepped forward, blocking the way. His face was no longer filled with anger, but something darker, more calculating. He raised his hand, signaling for Marcus to stop. Marcus' heart skipped a beat. What was going on? Why was the officer still here, waiting for them? "Turn off the sirens and stop the vehicle," Collins called out, his voice low and steady. Marcus hesitated for a second, then did as he was told, pulling the ambulance to a stop right in front of Collins. He knew something wasn't right. His gut told him this wasn't just another traffic stop, that this was about more than just a misunderstanding. He could feel the weight of Collins' gaze on him through the window. The officer wasn't just angry anymore. There was something else, something more dangerous, more personal. "Get out of the vehicle," Collins said, his tone hard and commanding. Marcus didn't move at first. Trey's breath caught in his throat, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Something was about to happen. The air was thick with impending violence. "Dad," Trey whispered, his voice filled with uncertainty. Marcus turned to look at his son, his eyes filled with a quiet reassurance, though he didn't have all the answers. "Stay inside," he said softly, not wanting Trey to see what was coming. But before Marcus could open the door, Collins stepped forward again, his hand on his gun, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and determination. "I told you," Collins said, his voice colder now. "You're not above the law." Marcus' stomach churned.
He knew what was happening now.
This wasn't about the ambulance. This wasn't even about the emergency. This was about Collins wanting control, about him lashing out in a way that was so deeply rooted in the prejudices he couldn't even see. Marcus glanced at the rear-view mirror. Trey was still sitting there, frozen, staring out the window with wide eyes, trying to make sense of everything that was happening. Marcus felt his heart tighten. He needed to protect him, but the officer wasn't backing down. Collins reached for his radio again, this time his hand shaking. "Backup, I need backup," he muttered under his breath. The words sent a wave of dread through Marcus. They were trapped. The backup wasn't just coming to help, they were coming to escalate. In that moment, the reality of their situation hit Marcus like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a bad day anymore. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was something much bigger, something more dangerous. It wasn't just about what had happened.
It was about what would happen next.
Marcus tried to steady his breathing, tried to calm his mind. There had to be a way out. But he couldn't see one. "Please," Trey said again, this time louder. "What's going on, Dad?" Before Marcus could respond, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The moment of silence had shattered. And in the distance, more lights flashed, closing in on them. The sirens grew louder, echoing off the nearby buildings. Marcus' heart pounded in his chest as the flashing lights crept closer, casting a red glow over everything. His thoughts scrambled. He could feel the weight of the situation, the heaviness of the decision that lay before him. It was no longer just about getting out of this alive. It was about his son. It was about Trey. But just as the first squad car screeched to a halt behind them, something unexpected happened. The sound of screeching tires echoed through the street, followed by the blinding headlights of a car racing toward them from the opposite direction. Marcus had snapped up just in time to see a black sedan barreling toward him at full speed. He didn't have time to react. The car slid to a stop just inches away from the ambulance, narrowly missing the front bumper, and then everything went still. The door of the sedan slammed open, and out stepped a woman. She was tall, her dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, wearing a leather jacket that looked like it had seen better days. She moved quickly, her eyes scanning the scene with urgency, and without a second of hesitation, she walked straight toward Collins. "Get away from him," she commanded, her voice cold and direct, as though she knew exactly what was going on. Collins seemed caught off guard. For a moment, he looked at the woman, his jaw tightening, before he stepped back, his hand instinctively going to his gun, but not pulling it out. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "You're not in charge here," he growled, but there was something else in his tone now, something that hinted at fear. The woman didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her posture unwavering. "I know exactly what's going on, Ray. I've been watching you. You're out of line." Ray Collins' eyes widened, his grip tightening on his weapon. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the ambulance, her eyes meeting Marcus for a brief moment, and then moved back to Collins. There was a calmness to her, a confidence, that left Marcus both uneasy and curious. "This isn't just about a traffic stop, is it?" the woman said, her eyes narrowing. "You've been watching him, haven't you?" Marcus was confused. Watching him? What did she mean? His heart began to race again as the words swirled in his mind, the tension between the two people escalating by the second. Trey shifted in his seat, still trying to piece together what was happening, his young mind struggling to process the reality of the situation. "Who the hell are you?" Collins growled, but his voice wavered slightly now, uncertainty seeping in. The woman stood tall, her gaze unshaken. "You know exactly who I am, and I know exactly who you are." Her eyes flicked to the growing number of squad cars pulling up behind her. "This ends now, Ray. It's over." Marcus' pulse quickened. This woman, whoever she was, seemed to know far more about the situation than anyone had a right to. Her words were cutting through the chaos, lacing everything with an intensity that neither he nor Collins had expected. There was a feeling in the air, a shift. What had begun as a confrontation with a rogue cop was now turning into something much more complicated. Just as Collins was about to respond, the sound of screeching tires interrupted him once again. Another car, this time a dark van, sped toward them, skidding to a halt behind the first. More figures stepped out, moving swiftly and with purpose, their eyes focused on the woman. The air felt charged, crackling with the promise of something dangerous. "Do you really want to do this, Ray?" one of the newcomers asked, his voice low and dangerous. He was tall, dressed in tactical gear, his face covered with a mask. The moment he stepped out of the van, Marcus could see the precision in the way they moved, the kind of coordination that could only come from years of experience. For the first time since the confrontation started, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. These people, whoever they were, weren't on Colin's side. The officer's authority seemed to falter under the weight of their presence. But Marcus still had no idea what this all meant, and his unease deepened. If this was some kind of intervention, why were they here? What had they come for? "You're outnumbered, Ray," the woman said, her tone almost bored, like this was all a routine. "You've been making the wrong calls for far too long. We've got everything we need." The officer's face twisted in fury, his eyes scanning the faces around him, but there was no escape. The backup he'd called for had arrived, but it wasn't in the form he'd expected. "Don't do this," Collins muttered, his voice shaking. "I've worked my whole life for this badge. You can't just—" "Don't," the woman interrupted sharply. "You've been making decisions based on fear for far too long. This isn't about the badge, Ray. This is about what's right." Marcus' mind was spinning. The officer's breakdown was a sight to behold. There was no control anymore, no confidence. It was as if everything Collins had relied on, the badge, the power, had just crumbled in an instant. The woman was right. The stakes had just been raised. But what did this mean for him? For Trey? Before Marcus could piece it all together, Trey spoke, his voice cutting through the air, quiet yet trembling. "Who are they, Dad?" Marcus didn't know what to say. The situation had spiraled into something far beyond what he had imagined. His world, once so predictable, had become a swirling storm of conflicting forces, each more dangerous than the last. And now, with these strangers surrounding them, Marcus could only feel that the stakes were higher than ever. As the officers surrounding them began to speak in low voices, signaling to each other in a language Marcus couldn't understand, he realized the weight of the moment. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just about the small confrontation anymore. The game had changed. Suddenly, the woman turned to Marcus, locking eyes with him for a brief moment. Her gaze held something he couldn't quite decipher, but he felt it. A warning. She knew more about him than he had ever imagined. And whatever it was that was happening now, he had no way of knowing how deep the rabbit hole went. Everything was about to change, and neither Marcus nor Trey could stop it. The air seemed to crackle with tension as the squad cars surrounded them, the flashing lights casting a disorienting glow across the street. Marcus' mind raced, still struggling to grasp everything that had happened in such a short amount of time. The woman who had intervened. Who was she? What was going on? The chaos felt like it was spiraling out of control, and yet there was something oddly satisfying about seeing Collins lose his grip on the situation. The officers who had come in support of the mysterious woman stood at the ready, their movements calm and practiced, as though they had done this 1,000 times. Collins, now flanked by them, looked like a man backed into a corner, his usual bravado shattered. "Ray, it's over," the woman said again, her voice devoid of any pity. Her eyes were cold, calculating, as she addressed the defeated officer. "You've been on the wrong side of things for too long. Now you'll face the consequences." Colin's face twisted with anger, but there was an underlying fear in his eyes, a realization that he couldn't hide anymore. He had been playing with fire, and now it was burning him. The woman stepped forward, signaling for one of the officers to approach Collins. As they did, Collins' breath hitched. He was trying to stand tall to look like he still had control, but it was clear to everyone that he didn't. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Collins muttered, almost pleading, though his voice lacked conviction. "I've done nothing wrong." The woman shook her head slowly. "You've been hiding behind your badge, Ray. Your actions speak louder than your excuses." For a moment, there was a heavy silence. Marcus, still sitting in the ambulance with Trey, didn't know what to feel. On the one hand, the pressure seemed to be lifting. The officer who had caused so much trouble was now on the verge of being brought to justice. But on the other, the uncertainty of what had just transpired, the sudden arrival of the mysterious woman and her backup, lingered in the air. There was more to this than met the eye. He could feel it. Just as Marcus thought the confrontation was over, the woman turned toward him, her gaze piercing through the chaos, landing squarely on him. For a moment, everything seemed to slow. She walked up to the ambulance, her expression unreadable, and with a calm that sent a chill down Marcus' spine. She opened the door. "Trey," she said, addressing his son, "come with me." Trey froze, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman looked at him with a somber expression. "I know this is hard to understand, but we don't have much time. There are things you need to know. About your father. About your future." Marcus felt a jolt of panic. "Trey, stay inside."
Don't.
But the woman's hand was already on Trey's shoulder, guiding him out of the vehicle with a forcefulness that couldn't be ignored. "Trust me, Marcus," she said, her tone soft but insistent. "This is for the best." The moment the door swung open, Trey took a hesitant step forward. His eyes darted between Marcus and the woman, clearly torn. But something in the woman's demeanor, the way she held herself, made him feel like he could trust her, even if he didn't fully understand why. Trey took another step, then another, until he was standing beside the woman. He didn't look back at his father, he couldn't. The uncertainty in his eyes, the confusion, made it clear that he was no longer sure of anything. He just followed the woman's lead, his heart pounding in his chest. Marcus' breath caught in his throat. His son was walking away, and he couldn't stop it. But deep down, he knew that something larger than both of them was unfolding right before their eyes. As the woman and Trey moved toward the group of officers, Marcus stood frozen, watching them disappear into the crowd. He felt an overwhelming sense of loss, as if something important was slipping through his fingers. Collins, now restrained by the officers, turned to the woman one last time. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You think any of this changes anything?" The woman didn't respond at first. She simply stared at him, her face calm, but her eyes cold. "No," she said after a long pause. "But it's time for the truth to come out. All of it." Suddenly, something clicked in Marcus' mind. The pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't just about an officer who had crossed the line. This wasn't just about a bad encounter. It was about something much bigger. Something that involved him and Trey in ways he couldn't have imagined. He felt a chill run down his spine as the woman's words echoed in his ears. The truth. What truth? What was she talking about? Before he could ask, the woman pulled out an envelope from inside her jacket and handed it to Marcus. "This is for you," she said quietly. "It explains everything." Marcus took the envelope, his hands trembling as he opened it. Inside was a letter, along with a series of photographs, some of them taken years ago. His mind raced as he scanned the images, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the faces staring back at him. It was him, but it was also someone else. Someone he didn't recognize. The letter was short, written in neat, precise handwriting. "Marcus, the past you've been running from is about to catch up with you. Everything you think you know is about to change. Trey's future is more connected to this than you realize. Don't trust the people around you. Follow the truth, and you'll find the answers you need." As Marcus read the words, his thoughts spiraled out of control. What was happening? Who had sent this? And what did it all mean for Trey? Before he could process any more, the woman turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing there, staring at the envelope in his hands. The world around him had shifted in ways he hadn't thought possible, and now, with his son's future hanging in the balance, the answers were just out of reach. The woman had given him a choice, but it was a choice he didn't fully understand yet. And as he looked at Trey, who was now being escorted toward the van, Marcus knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Marcus stood frozen, the envelope clutched tightly in his hands, his mind still reeling from the letter and the cryptic words the woman had left with him. Trey was already being ushered away, the officers moving around him like they were part of a well-rehearsed routine. The air, once thick with tension and fear, now felt heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. He glanced down at the envelope again, his heart pounding. The words on the paper seemed to mock him. "The past you've been running from is about to catch up with you." What past? And how is Trey involved in all of this? His thoughts were racing, each question building on the last. He needed answers. More than that, he needed to protect Trey, to figure out what this meant for his son's future. A voice behind him broke his train of thought. Marcus. It was the woman, the one who had appeared out of nowhere and turned the situation upside down. She had stopped just a few steps away, watching him with a calm intensity. "We need to talk." Marcus turned to face her, his eyes hard. He wasn't sure whether he was angry, confused, or just scared, but all he knew was that he needed to get to the bottom of this, before it was too late. "What do you want from me? What's going on here?" She didn't answer immediately, her gaze flicking back to Trey, who was still being surrounded by the officers, his confusion evident. "What I want is for you to understand what's at stake," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of authority that made Marcus' stomach twist. "You've been living in the dark for too long, Marcus. And now, your son's future is in danger." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of the mystery that had unfolded over the past few hours. "What do you mean? Is Trey in danger?" The woman sighed, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and something else Marcus couldn't quite place. "Trey's involvement in this, his connection to all of this, it's more important than you realize. You're not just some random paramedic. You've been chosen, Marcus. The way you've been living your life, it's all part of a larger plan, one that you've never fully understood." Marcus felt a cold chill run down his spine. He wanted to ask more, to demand an explanation, but something in her eyes told him that words alone couldn't answer the questions he had. This wasn't just about police corruption or a random encounter with an officer. It was something deeper, something connected to him and Trey in a way he couldn't yet grasp. The woman continued, her tone unwavering. "Ray Collins, he's not who you think he is. He's been working with people who are far more dangerous than anyone knows. And his obsession with you, with Trey, it's all part of a much bigger picture." Marcus' mind spun. "What does Collins want with us?
Why?
What's his connection to my son?" She paused, as if weighing whether or not to give him the full truth. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "Trey's father wasn't just a paramedic. He was a key part of a covert operation. And your son, he's the heir to that legacy. Collins and the others, they know this. They've been watching you, waiting for the moment to strike." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. This was impossible. His mind was flooded with memories of his life, of the days before he became a paramedic, before he had Trey. He'd always thought his past was simple, just a man trying to make a living, to raise his son the best way he knew how. But now it was clear that there was so much more he hadn't known, more than he could have ever imagined. "You're telling me that Trey's father, my father, was involved in some kind of operation?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. The woman nodded, her face grim.
"Yes.
"And now they're coming for Trey. The powers that be, they'll stop at nothing to get to him, to use him for their own purposes. They'll use his bloodline to manipulate everything he represents. That's why we're here. To protect him. To stop Collins before he can carry out his plans." Marcus felt his mind spinning. His father. His son. A legacy he'd never known about. He had always believed that he was just a simple man, trying to do right by his son, but now he realized everything he thought he knew was a lie. The weight of that truth crushed him, and the fear for Trey's safety tightened around his chest. "Trey doesn't deserve any of this," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "He's just a kid. How is he supposed to understand any of this?" The woman's expression softened slightly. "That's why we're here. To guide him. To give him the tools he'll need to survive. You can't protect him forever, Marcus. But you can prepare him." Marcus felt his stomach turn. He was drowning in confusion, the enormity of the situation settling on him like a mountain. "And what happens now? What's next?" The woman paused for a moment, her eyes shifting to the squad cars that had now started to pull away, the officers retreating into the shadows. "Now we leave," she said simply. "We take Trey, and we make sure that he's safe, that he understands the truth. We help him understand his role in all of this." Marcus wanted to argue, to refuse, to demand that his son stay with him, but he knew deep down that he didn't have a choice. Trey's life wasn't simple anymore, and it hadn't been for a long time. He had been caught in something much bigger than himself. I don't know if I can do this, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I'm strong enough. The woman placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. You are. You always have been. With that, she turned and walked toward Trey, who was standing by the van now, looking up at the woman with wide eyes. Marcus followed, his mind still reeling. The woman paused when she reached Trey and turned to look back at Marcus. Everything's about to change, she said softly. But it doesn't have to be a fight. You have the power to make it right. You just have to trust him. Trust yourself. As the woman led Trey away, Marcus watched them disappear into the night, the weight of his past settling in his bones. He wasn't sure where the road ahead would lead, but one thing was clear. His life, and his son's life, would never be the same. The past he had tried to escape was now part of him, part of Trey's future. And it was up to them to decide how it would end. In that moment, as he stood in the cold night air, Marcus realized that the greatest battle they would face wasn't with the forces trying to control them, but with the choices they would make to reclaim their future. And for the first time in years, Marcus felt the faintest glimmer of hope.